Welcome to eCommerce Deep Dive, a podcast featuring the biggest players in retail and e-commerce. Your host is John Giorso, founder and CEO of Orca Pacific, a Mighty Hive company. For today's episode, John is joined by Raj De Datta, serial entrepreneur and co-founder and CEO of Bloomreach. Raj and John talk about Raj's new book, The Digital Seeker, a guide for digital teams to build winning experiences. They also discuss how recent innovation in technology has transformed digital experiences. Thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoy the show.
Raj, welcome to the show.
John, great to be here with you.
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot to get into. Would love to start with just a little bit about you, the company you co-founded, and the book.
I'm CEO and co-founder of Bloomreach, which is the third startup I've been involved in getting up off the ground. And so I've been a multiple-time entrepreneur out here in Silicon Valley. And this latest venture is all about e-commerce. And so I'm excited to talk about that. The company's called Bloomreach. It's the leader in what we call e-commerce experiences, which you can think of as everything involving e-commerce until you hit add to cart. So all the search experiences, the browse experiences, the personalization, interaction with content, marketing, et cetera, everything it takes you to get you to an e-commerce website, find the right product, and end up buying. And today we power about 750 of the largest brands around, big brands like The Gap and Williams-Sonoma and several of the properties that are owned by the Walmart groups, and also upstart brands that are coming online like BrewDog and Olakai and so on and so forth. And so, most of these brands, they work with us because they're trying to drive growth in e-commerce. And so, people would come to me and they would say, hey, Raj, you guys are powering almost a quarter of e-commerce in the US and the UK. What are you seeing from the winners and what are you seeing from the losers? What causes the winners to win big in digital and what causes the losers to lose? And so between my venture investing and my experience with Bloomreach, I thought I'd write a book to answer that question. And so The Digital Seeker, which is what this book is my answer to that question. And it's available now on both on Amazon if you go search for The Digital Seeker, or if you go to bloomreach.com/digital seeker, you'll find a number of places to buy the book.
Perfect. I think that's great kind of starting context here. So that's a big question to try to answer in a book. I guess what is the headline? What's the kind of overriding thesis? And then I want to dive into some of the specifics from there. But I mean, can it be answered in a few sentences?
Actually, I think it can. And
okay.
and the core thesis of the book, and it's sort of from 100+ interviews and my experience, is that winning digital experiences are built for the seeker, not the customer. And that sounds a little counterintuitive because the question, of course, is, well, what exactly is a seeker?
Sure.
in that. But for 20 years we've been hearing about customer-centric marketing and building for the customers and understanding customers. And to make this really real, let's use sort of just real life examples to explain the difference between a seeker and a customer. Suppose we were out, organizing a family vacation. And so, at some point I'm going to do some research about the destinations and the tours and whether or not, there's kids activities involved. I'm going to look into a hotel. I'm going to look into car rental. I might look into flights. I might read reviews. So I'm actually a potential customer of all those services. I'm a potential customer of a car rental company. I'm of a hotel, of a tour company, et cetera. So I'm a potential customer of maybe 10 different products and services on the web, the things I'm going to take on the trip, at least. But I'm actually only a seeker of one thing, which is I'm a seeker of a memorable, relaxing family vacation. Yeah. So the seeker is the why behind the customer. It's the reason you're a customer in the first place. And what's so interesting is when you just focus on the transactional activity of serving your customers and miss out on the why, then you're just in a commodity market competing with everybody else out on the web. But if you ask the why question, you have the opportunity to build these really distinct experiences that stand apart. And those distinct experiences attract a loyal following, which then mean your online presence stands out, you acquire more customers, and you grow a lot faster. And we can pick industry after industry, and we can go through fashion and travel and exercise equipment and sports, and we can find who serves the seeker and who serves the customer.
So do you have a specific example of that in consumer products? So,
Yeah.
kind of a commodity versus someone that's kind of broken out of that commodity.
Well, let's take a couple of examples just to use some diversity here. So if you take fashion and you say, well, fashion has been sold through department stores for a long time, and there's been the Neiman Marcuses, there's been the Nordstroms, there's been a long legacy of high-end luxury fashion retailers. And then someone like Stitch Fix comes along and they disrupt the market. And how do they disrupt the market? Well, they didn't come up with more fashionable clothing than you can get at Neiman or Nordstrom or Saks or any of these other places, right?
Sure.
What they did is they said, well, look, they may be a customer of luxury apparel, of a scarf or of a dress or of a pair of shoes, but really what they're seeking is to find clothing that matches their style and their identity and their expression. And so Stitch Fix said, we're not going to just sell you the clothing, we're going to sell you the stylist. And by selling you the stylist and you inputting your personalization into it, your personal style into it, we're going to know you better, and the clothing is going to come out of that. And that's because the customer might be a customer of the apparel, but the seeker is seeking a unique expression of their style. And so that's the contrast that comes out in these seeker-centric experiences. I'll use a completely different example, which is in the healthcare space as an example, right? So we work with the healthcare provider in the UK called NHS Digital, and they are the healthcare provider in the UK. They run the doctors' offices in the hospitals and so on and so forth.
Yeah, there's only one, right?
There's only one, right?
Yeah.
And so NHS Digital, what they ended up finding is that lots of people would come to emergency rooms with conditions that don't require emergency rooms fundamentally. And so they said, well, all right, we could just put a bunch of literature. You can go to Google and you can type any symptom and find knowledge. But is the patient really looking for knowledge? If you've got a sick kid in the middle of the night who's coughing up a storm, or do you give them an Advil or Tylenol to sleep it away, or do you rush them to the emergency room? How do you know the answer to that question? And so the seeker is seeking reassurance. And so they built this thing called a symptom checker, which is like a minimum, like a triaging system that you can put online that helps somebody not solve the ailment, but figure out what to do next, given the symptoms that are sort of there. And it's so much better than putting in random queries into Google with your symptoms and hoping for the best.
Yeah, you're either going to be fine or you're going to die tomorrow, and it's 50-50 shot.
Exactly.
We've all done that. Yeah.
Exactly. So that's then going to the underlying motivation that the parent or the patient is looking for reassurance, really more than they are looking for the medical answer of all the possibilities.
Yeah, interesting. So there's so many places we could go here, but because we're sort of, as a world, I think we're in part kind of getting close to the end of COVID, hopefully here, knock on wood. But 2020 was very much in the thick of it, and I think we all know it changed consumer behavior in a significant way. How does COVID kind of impact this overriding thesis that you have?
Yeah, well, it makes everything about digital, 10 times more important, first and foremost, right? What we saw in our data is that e-commerce grew, leap almost 100% year over year. Last year, it was about a 5 to 6 year acceleration in e-commerce, whether you look at spending or revenue, or for us, API calls into our platform. Every metric skyrocketed, right? Yeah. So every project became mission critical in that process. And this need to stand out became that much more important, in digital. And so you could no longer say, hey, it's okay if digital is this project on the side that might work out. It became the core of the business itself. And if it becomes the core of the business, then you really have to win, because if you lose in digital, you lose in general.
Yeah.
As a whole. And so I get a lot more questions about that. And so post-pandemic, the way I would put it is, to use a COVID term, it accelerates the R naught, or, the R naught is the rate at which the infection has sort of spread. And like that, digital advocacy has gone, leaps and bounds. We've seen that in categories like grocery, where it's gone through the roof. We've seen that in categories like autos that were never bought online that have gone through the roof. And then we've seen just the same people who were in digital spend a lot more money of their wallet share, on digital as a whole as a result of the pandemic. And we're seeing those trends continue post-pandemic as well.
Yeah. Okay. So that's really interesting. Because you have access to so much data, I think this is everyone has an opinion on this, but you'll probably have an actual, more kind of informed one. There's general sort of concept that the COVID basically just accelerated the inevitable. And like, I think that's mostly true.
Right.
And I think most people in this industry have kind of, I would say that's the consensus at this point. Is there anything that you think COVID kind of fundamentally like changed beyond where we would have been anyway in 5 years? I mean, and we saw some kind of specific things that were, weird. Everyone bought bread makers in April of last year for like, there's weird, very specific kind of things that will never happen again. But is there any kind of like long-term impact you think to consumer behavior that COVID kind of unleashed?
Yeah, and we say accelerated the inevitable, but the inevitable doesn't always take a straight line. And so we've seen people have been predicting e-commerce is a 20-year-old industry at this point plus, right? And so people have been talking about entire categories going to e-commerce for a long time, and certain categories never did. Certain demographics, older demographics as an example, didn't adopt it quite as much. Certain categories that were more considered purchases, like autos or things of that type, have had very low penetration. Grocery, sort of same thing. So, yes, it accelerated it, but I wouldn't say it was inevitable. It actually just made it happen. And more importantly, it changed and cemented that consumer behavior so that post-pandemic, you ask the question, does it make sense to go back? You have a new baseline to operate from. You're not operating from the baseline of mostly physical, some digital. Now you're operating from a baseline of mostly digital and asking the question, what should be physical? So when you ask it that way, it actually means a fairly substantial sort of change in lifestyle. And, I'll just give you one example of something that is at the end of the book, which is really about, what I call an economic boom and a happiness boom, a sort of twin boom that happens at the end of this period of time. The economic boom is, well, look, if everything is digital, all of a sudden there's enormous amounts of productivity gains that we can get because we're not all commuting to work every day, and because we're not all stuck in airports all the time, and because we're much more purposeful about our interactions and what we can do physically and what we can do digitally. We just created time in our life. That drives economic productivity. But it also means that, if for some jobs, I'm not always commuting every day and, 2 hours a day in and out, of an office, and I'm in front of my computer screen a lot of the day, it actually means, interestingly, that I'm really psyched to go out in the evening and hang out at a restaurant with friends, or go to a local bar, or do something, so I actually think the neighborhood physical locations will boom because people have got to get out from under their, and if there's one thing the pandemic has told us, it's been awesome from a work productivity perspective, but it's totally sucked from a personal relationship and, kind of family, friends, relationship building perspective. So we all hunger for that. We're going to want more of it and do more work digitally and more fun physically, I think.
Yeah, I actually think that's a really interesting idea that basically we kind of keep the good, and because we don't have to anymore, we don't have to social distance and do those things, kind of get rid of the bad part. But what you end up with is, and it's funny because I know we're going off on a tangent, but this is just personally really interesting to me. My company, we have about 60 people now in the US. We've always had this kind of flexible work from home.
Yeah,
we have an office, come into the office, work from home, do whatever the need requires, right? If you have a client, obviously it's in person, but we've kind of had that. And what you find is you are absolutely ready to get out of your house at the end of the day in normal non-COVID times, right? That's the idea that it kind of bolsters like local communities actually long-term.
Yeah.
Which I think means people move out of cities and get into more kind of, community-based, smaller cities or towns or neighborhoods. I think that's fascinating. Have you, it may be too early to tell, have you seen any indications in the data that's happening in terms of, we're a few iterations
from that. But what we're seeing now in the data is more like the spurt or the boom, at least in the US, as certain cities and communities come out of the pandemic. And so, just as we saw getting into the pandemic that everybody was buying, bread and eggs and toilet paper and all of that. Well, coming out, all of a sudden makeup sales are through the roof because people are kind of going out. People are all of a sudden, leisure travel. People are expecting this to be among the busiest leisure travel summers, we've seen in a long time. And so all the outdoor gear that comes along with that and all the travel amenities that come along with that. So there's a different category of things that become in demand as these booms take place.
Yeah, so we're we obviously we're in the COVID period. We're now in sort of the reaction to the COVID period.
That's right.
But we still haven't reached that quote unquote long-term new normal.
That's right. We haven't reached the long-term new normal yet. I think we're early.
Everyone was making bread at home. Now everyone's going to Hawaii. And then at some point, things are going to kind of normalize. And, some of this will be sticky and some of it will return to baseline. That's super interesting. So back to kind of this core thesis of the book. So you have this idea of the 3 A's. Do you want to kind of dive into that and explain it?
Yeah, absolutely. So if we establish that, you win big in digital by building for the seeker, by building for the why behind the customer, then the question is, how do you go about doing that? And the next most important question is, well, if you can't build these seeker-centric experiences with just, human beings manually curating everything, technology is at the root of making that happen. And so the question that I often get is, what are the key technologies I need to pay attention to? And how do I harness them to build these unique seeker-centric experiences? And so I try to boil that down into the 3 A's. And so the first A is ambient devices, which is there's just an explosion of listening and sensors to understand what the seeker is seeking in the first place, right? Every click is a vote. Every non-click is a non-vote. Every mobile device is a sensor. Obviously you've got IoT out there. So increasingly we have all these ambient devices collecting information about what our consumers are interested in the first place. And that's the first A, is ambient. The second A is AI. So now I've got all the signal. I got to now make sense of it. If you're Uber, you've got to make sense of all the people moving around and the cars moving around. You can't possibly do that manually. AI is playing a role in distilling that to try to figure out what car to send to whom, or what house to recommend to whom in the case of Airbnb, or what product to recommend in the case of Amazon, out there. So the AI is playing a role in making sense of the data. And the third A is APIs, which is a little bit of tech speak, but is really important because if I'm building seeker-centric experiences, I'm marshaling lots of services together and giving something really simple to the end consumer. So if I take that Uber driving experience, they've got to include mapping software, they've got to include payments built in, they've got to include estimations for how long it's going to take to get from point A to point B. These are all services provided by lots of different entities that APIs reach out to, pull back, and present a really distilled, on-point, personalized experience back to the consumer. So the third A is really APIs.
Hey there, I'm Dave Zimmerman with Orca Pacific. I hope you're enjoying the show. I wanted to let you know this episode is brought to you by Orca Pacific, a Mighty Hive company. We're a full-service agency exclusively focused on Amazon with capabilities for everything a brand needs to succeed on the platform. From advertising strategy, content development and SEO, to merchandising and marketing. If it relates to driving and converting demand on the platform, our dedicated teams are leaders in this space. Our robust suite of services includes expertise on the back end as well, from operational support, demand forecasting and planning, to the right fulfillment options, and higher level strategies like long-term planning, channel management, and access to beta programs. To learn more, visit our website at www.orcapac.com. That's ORCAPAC.com. And a business development manager will get you up to speed on how we can accelerate your Amazon business. Now, back to the show.
So Alexa and Google Home, and I know I just triggered a bunch of people's devices at home, so apologize. But so this idea that there's these kind of ambient devices, and I know certainly, there's thousands, hundreds of thousands of manufacturers out there, but really there's 2 platforms, in my opinion, that all of this is going to go through. How does that kind of, walled garden, in your opinion, longer term, impact this concept? Of course, there's skills and maybe apps eventually, through these platforms. Is it a similar analogy to, sure, iOS is dominant, but you still have millions of apps out there, so it doesn't really matter? Or do you think that kind of changes this dynamic?
Well, I think it's really interesting because in the first kind of 20 years of the web and e-commerce, what we've seen is only concentration of power, right? We've basically seen Google get, the FANG
Just more
stocks.
and more and more. Yeah,
More and more on Facebook, Google, Microsoft, Amazon, et cetera, right? Apple. So those five have gotten entrenched power. But I actually think that we're at the beginning and we're at the very early stages of it, of sort of an emergence of an ecosystem that where many more companies start to really benefit from this than just those five companies, that are out there. And, the early signals on that, come from the Shopify ecosystem, right? So here's Shopify. Now it itself is a huge platform, but Shopify more so than any of these other companies is really a place I go build an e-commerce storefront. Like I'm not handing over data. They're not advertising to me. They're a software platform for me to go really easily build a storefront.
You own it ultimately.
You own it ultimately, right? And so that model has then created a sort of, I think they call it the rebels, but the rebels building these storefronts.
Arming the rebels,
Arming the rebels, right? But whether it's the Shopify platform or whether it's the Bloomreach platform, if you're a slightly bigger business and you're worried about competing with Amazon, you don't need Amazon for AI. You don't need their data set because we have the data set for the other 75% of the web, that's out there. So the arms merchants are making it possible, whether it's Shopify or Bloomreach and a whole cascade of others, for the cloud vendors make computing power, really accessible. So now it's a little bit like the utilities have laid the groundwork of the train tracks and the electricity grids. So lots of other people get to build on it. It isn't just the private railway companies that mint money now.
It makes sense. And I agree. I guess for me, the question is, do we see this sort of, I don't want to say democratization, but use the FANG as sort of the utility, concept that they've done all the big heavy lift and now we can, and Shopify and others. But that the access to the customer in the physical world via voice computing or voice first computing, which probably ultimately is screens and other, inputs and outputs. But that kind of then creates the reverse, it goes back the other direction where basically these two companies are able to sort of corner the access to the customer.
It's in the first generation of marketing, the way we've thought about the world is Google's got the customers, people are searching on Google, or the customers are hanging out on Facebook. We got to go reach them. And with that mindset, absolutely, we're stuck. We're stuck needing to advertise on Facebook or advertise on Google or maybe advertise on the Amazon marketplace in some fashion to acquire customers. But if you flip it around and you say, all right, I'm in the business of selling turbines. I'm in the business of selling sofas. I'm in the business. Is there any particular reason why somebody should go to Google or Facebook or Amazon if they can find an experience that's amazing for buying sofas that you build? Because the experience, I can promise you, the experience of buying sofas on Amazon or Google or Facebook isn't that great.
Yep. Agreed.
Right. So if you could build, just to use that example and thinking out loud, if you are the Williams-Sonoma brands or Pottery Barn and you've shopped at Pottery Barn once, and I can build an incredible experience that is the best sofa buying experience on the planet, which I should be able to do better than Google can, then that customer is going to come directly to me, ultimately. Yep. This paradigm of people going to Google or people going to Facebook is fundamentally because that's been the best choice that's out there. Is I get unlimited selection. But if I give you something really unique, then people are going to, and we see that in the data as well. When people build these unique seeker-centric experiences, loyalty increases, repeat purchases increase, more direct traffic occurs, and then you're not paying Google for clicks.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I often, as related to Amazon, talk about this concept of sort of shopping versus buying, and that Amazon is really, really good, and they have masterfully optimized buying. I think that something like 30% of transactions happen in less than 3 minutes. I mean, the average retail transaction, the physical world's like an hour or something to
That's right.
start to finish. So that they figured out, but what they've never really been able to figure out is the quote unquote shopping. I think that maybe is not a direct
That's right.
analogy to the experience, but they're very similar.
They're very similar. I mean, I think I would use experience in the same vein as you use shopping, which is sort of, it's the, if you've already figured out what you're looking for, Amazon's great. Put it into the search bar, find it, add to cart, click, have it show up. Awesome from that perspective. Very transactional experience. And so there's a class of shopping that is exactly that. But there's a lot more. All that has really happened, all that Amazon has really done is they've said, you used to walk into a retail store, have a consultative experience, think about it, compare, do all of that, and then decide what to buy, and then bring it to the cash register and then pay for it and walk out the store. So they've taken that last mile and made it really easy. But actually what they've done is they've shifted the burden of the first part of that experience, the thinking about it, the getting invested in a brand, the comparison, the research, the consultation of what's good for your needs. They've actually made that your problem as a consumer.
Yeah.
Right? They've shifted it and they've just said, you go deal with that because we can't automate all of that. So we'll just deal with the transactional last mile. And yet we think Amazon's amazing, right? Well, it is amazing, but it's only doing 1/8 of the shopping experience.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think that the reason we've seen, in COVID, the reason we've seen a lot of the kind of folks other than Amazon, at least on a percentage basis, grow more than they have is mostly out of necessity. But I do think that there is room for really curated, catered experiences that, especially around certain categories, where Amazon just has a very difficult time doing that, because whatever they do for running shoes also has to work for a toaster, which has to work for a video game. I mean, there is some obviously differentiation, customization, but largely the platform's the platform.
Well, there's no, and I can give you from our Bloomreach example and from the book that, lots of examples of that. So whether it's Puma and running shoes, I mean, if you want performance shoes and you go check out the experience on Puma, versus on Amazon, it's night and day, in terms of what you'll get. Yeah. So you're generic, somebody who doesn't really care about what shoes, great. But you're an athlete, you're a competitive athlete, you want performance soccer shoes, you're going to go check out the Puma experience and it's going to give you a better result. I'll take another, since we're on the thread of soccer. One of the businesses we work with is called Bayern Munich, which is the 5th largest sports franchise in the world, and it's the soccer team that is out of Munich in Germany. Okay. That is the Premier League soccer team there, and it's got 1 billion fans around the world, like much bigger than an NFL franchise.
Wow!
And Bayern Munich, back to the seeker centricity, sort of started by thinking of itself as a soccer team, but realized over the course of time they're really a media company. And so you look at the experience of, somebody is a fan in New York City of the team. They can't go to Allianz Stadium in Munich to attend a game, but you can go on there, have a virtual reality experience with the player, order a custom jersey, feel like you're at the game. Now, is Amazon going to build that? That's commerce too.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I that's actually a super interesting example. So yeah, I think at the end of the day, there's a world where kind of both exist and both win.
That's right.
And so I've always had this kind of working thesis that the majority of commerce is actually just like buying, but that there is a meaningful percentage that is experience based, certainly enough to build a business, as large as probably anyone aspires to, maybe other than Amazon and Walmart and a few others. But, and that if you can create, then the race is the quality of that experience, which is kind of going up straight, up in terms of the value chain versus what Amazon is doing, which I think they would admit, which is just easy and cheap and fast.
Easy, yeah. That's
a skill game.
Right.
Once there's one winner there, or maybe two, because you can't, that once you have that kind of race to the bottom, it's the biggest, most scaled player is going to win. But the experience game gets just fragmented into 1,000
That's right.
pieces.
It gets fragmented into 1,000 pieces with specialists,
Yes.
who
Yeah.
who then say, eyeglasses. What is that? What's reinventing, eyeglasses for the seeker? And let's just keep going category after category. But I think when you sum the commerce in that fragmented category of experiential commerce, it's going to end up being larger than the transactional commerce.
Interesting. I think when you factor in, because when I think, I kind of think in the lane of products. So depending on kind of how you're defining, well, certainly commerce is beyond that. But yeah, that's super interesting. There's a topic here on our list, B2B digital experience.
Yeah.
I think that's something that often gets overlooked. Yeah, even though right now in the US, I still think B2B e-commerce, and that's kind of a fuzzy thing to define. But as it's defined, is about twice as big as
That's right.
B2B, or I'm sorry, retail e-commerce.
That's right.
But I mean, people kind of don't understand that or passes them by. Arguably, there's been a lot less innovation there as well, or at least maybe obvious innovation. There's a question in here, I promise. I guess what are your thoughts overall? What's your take on that space?
Yeah, so we work with a ton of folks in B2B commerce, and I think right now the rate of innovation in B2B commerce has really exploded. That has been a post-pandemic reaction, even more so than B2C, because the B2B folks were, 7% of B2B commerce was online. 15% of retail e-commerce was online. The 15 went to kind of, high 20s overnight, but the 7 went to high 20s overnight too. And that's what happened with the pandemic. Now, I think what's interesting about B2B commerce is, of course, there's lots of different categories, but to just make it, very real, if you're, we work with people who are providing supplies to restaurants, or, air conditioning technicians who are ordering air conditioning parts, or auto parts, which are highly complicated, technically specified products that you got to find online. Previously what you would do is you would call a salesperson, and the salesperson would work you through exactly what you needed for your air conditioner, for your restaurant, or for your industrial plant, that's out there. Sure. And now increasingly people, want to do what they're doing at home, which is order online. But it turns out creating a great B2B experience online is a ton more complex than a B2C, because you're talking about needing to match technical. You can't put the wrong auto part with the wrong car. Like, you can't just randomly recommend auto parts. People who viewed this bought this. That doesn't work in B2B, right? It's got to fit with the individual vehicle. You've got contractual relationships that you've got to honor. I might have an account, and that might affect my pricing and everything else. And then this whole idea of personalization, which has been around in B2C, and I would say still has a way to go in B2C. But in B2B, it means something different, because you're not often personalizing for the individual. You're personalizing for an account or for a company, with a whole bunch of other considerations in that process. So I actually think the innovation that's going on in B2B commerce right now is on a very steep curve, because people are reinventing supply chains, reinventing customer experiences, and I'm very bullish on what kind of growth we're going to see in B2B commerce.
That's super interesting. I think fundamentally what you're describing is something that is much harder if traditionally humans always been involved in commerce, the B2B side, it's much, much harder to replace that human. Because if you need a new, 10 pack of pens, you don't need a salesperson at Staples to tell you, it's a pen, you buy it, you're done. But if you're buying, 10,000 packs of pens for, your corporate headquarters, which is spread across 4 states, and there's compliance and tax, and, it the same here? And this one needs to be branded or whatever it is. Obviously, that's something that is much, much harder to replicate with technology. I assume AI is going to be an increasingly important part of that.
AI is a huge part of that. And we use a lot of the AI in B2B commerce to do things like figure out exactly what parts we're talking about, exactly what pens we're talking about, really matching the right things to the right people, to the right accounts, making sure the relevance of that experience is high quality, understanding customer segments. There's a lot, where AI can play a role in distilling that. And we've seen, really interesting effects as well, where you can really move the needle. Typically in retail e-commerce, it's about more sales. In B2B commerce, it is about more sales, but it is also about more efficiency, because it means that you're not hiring all these human beings who are undertaking these processes manually. You have less people calling into the call center and calling in, to your salespeople, and more people transacting online means that you're spending less money, on serving those people with real human beings.
So who wins ultimately in B2B commerce? Do you think it's the sort of the historic entrenched players just, get more innovative, use, companies like you as partners to kind of, fend off the startups, the disruptors, Amazon, and others that are trying to kind of, edge their way into this space? Or do you think it's the tech companies, Amazon and others that ultimately come in and kind of and really disrupt things?
Yeah. So, if we were to take two parts of the B2B commerce ecosystem, just as in on the consumer side, you've got retailers and brands. And Amazon's really a retailer. And of course, so is, Neiman Marcus, and so is Target, and so is Walmart. Those are all retailers. But then you've got brands going direct, right? And that's Puma selling their shoes directly instead of selling it through Sports Authority. So you've got an emergence of brands on the retail side. Exactly the same thing is happening in B2B. So you've got B2B distributors. And in fact, Amazon business is, I don't know what, a $10 billion plus business at this point. It's a big business. And so you've got a long set of distributors, and you've got people in the electrical distribution area and the food distribution area. And you've got distributors who are a lot like retailers. They compete on selection and account control and delivering a great experience there. And they're really trying to go for scale and using digital to go at it. And I think there will be a consolidated, smaller group of winners there with large businesses. And then you've got the manufacturers. And manufacturers are just, if there's anybody who's earliest to e-commerce, it's actually B2B manufacturers. So take a Bloomreach client like Bosch, that makes a whole bunch of industrial equipment. They are now starting to sell online, but they're selling online to businesses. And so they were only making their manufactured products available through distributors. Now they're making it available, much more directly and building direct to customer relationships. So the same trend we see in retail and brands is happening with distributors and manufacturers in B2B. Just
interesting.
Just
so you
a couple of years behind.
Fundamentally the same kind of market dynamics of
I think it's the same kind of market dynamic, but I think the rate of disruption of distributors and manufacturers will be a lot slower because it's a lot harder to disrupt electrical components than it is to disrupt apparel.
Yeah. I mean, I thought, and they're doing fine, I think, by most measures, but I thought Amazon Business would actually be much larger by now than they are. Yeah. Based on the historic just kind of curve that you see when Amazon gets into a new category. The problem, though, really is it's not just a new category. It's obviously It's a fundamentally different business for all the reasons.
And not only that, but within B2B commerce are probably 50 categories. Yeah, like it's everything. Things are totally different between office supplies and food distribution.
Yeah, sure. And they have their own complete unique set of regulation and issues and customers. And
that's right.
Yeah. Raj, I want to be kind of respectful of your time here. Before we go, kind of tell us one more time where people can find the book and if they want to get in touch with you or learn more about the platform, what they can do.
Yeah, awesome. Well, feel free to check out bloomreach.com. That really takes us through the software that drives growth in e-commerce and all the offerings we have there. On bloomreach.com, if you go to bloomreach.com/digital seeker, you'll see a number of resources related to the topic of how to grow e-commerce and where the book can be found as a playbook, for digital teams. And then, of course, you can go to Amazon and search for the Digital Seeker, and the book's available for order.
Awesome. Hey, thanks so much for being on.
Thanks, John.